welcome to this conversation organized by Alianza Americas regarding the constitutional reform in El Salvador. Today, we're going to analyze the changes promoted by the Legislative Assembly and its implications for the democracy and the rule of law. Today, we're being accompanied by an expert on these topics, Ruth Eleonora López. She's a lawyer and head of justice in Cristosal organization. Ruth is a fundamental voice in defending democracy and human rights in El Salvador, and recently was recognized by BBC London as one of the 100 women that are most inspiring and influencing in the world in 2024. Thank you very much, Ruth, for being here with us. Thank you very much for your invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here, not only with Alianza Americas, but the other people and organizations that are here to listen about their constitutional reform in El Salvador. Thank you very much. Well, there are some prior indications. We will have interpretation to English that is turned on, simultaneous interpretation. And before we begin, we want to ask that you can share your questions in the chat, or you can ask for participation by raising your hand in the Q&A at the end of the meeting. We'll have space to respond to all your questions. Ruth, welcome, and thank you for joining us. To begin, we have a question that will allow us to discuss the topic is what topics are used by the Legislative Assembly in El Salvador to make this constitutional reform? Well, first of all, I think it's important to give a context regarding the El Salvador Constitution. The Constitution was approved in 1963, and before it had 23 reforms. The majority of them were structural reforms when it came to the structure and functioning of the Constitution, but also there had been some modifications related to acknowledging rights, for example, indigenous people. In all cases, it was approved under the procedure established in Article 248 of the Constitution. It was approved by two legislative assemblies. That is very important to remember. In 2012, before the Legislative Assembly, there was, when the Constitution was reformed, to be able to remove the possibility of choose congressmen, for example, the order of the candidatures that are proposed by the political parties. The Constitutional Assembly that was organized in that moment determined that in 2012, it presented a series of stages in a very didactic way, described the stages for the constitutional reforms. Among them, it, with a lot of detail, the possibility that the Salvadorian people could participate in those constitutional reforms through its participation in the elections. What means was that the Salvador people can vote for reform or not. Instead, it meant that, Ruth, my apologies, right now, there are a lot of communication, there's a lot of echo on your audio. Can you hear me better? If you can adjust your microphone or get closer, please. Yes, of course. A bit, can you hear me better? Or maybe they say no. Give me a minute, please, to try to improve this. Please, thank you. Can you, is it better now? They say you can still hear some echo. Maybe if you remove your headphones. Is it better now? The same conditions? Can you hear me? Go ahead. Hello? 1, 2, 1, 2. That is a bit better, yes. Sorry for interrupting. There's always echo, yes. So what I mentioned was that at that moment, we are 2012, and it's not that the citizens had to vote in the election as for a referendum. Instead, that through the electoral process, the citizens had the possibility to know what reforms had been proposed before so that with their vote they could choose congressmen that they felt were they coincided with a criteria if they voted for them or not vote for these congress people that would promote a constitutional reform. So that's a simple explanation. They not only needed those two legislative assemblies, so two different legislative assemblies, but as well an election in the middle point. And from that election, the citizens could intervene. So that with the propaganda that was done by the political parties and the candidates during the legislative elections, and this way people could get to know this process of the constitutional reform and what were their proposals from one or the other. As it turns out that take into consideration this phase and this what determined by the Constitutional Assembly after the 2024 elections, that we have to remember that 2024 elections occurred at 2 points. One, presidential level, which was in February, and the legislative and municipal in March. Well, as it happens, April 29th, after elections, the 2024 elections finalized, 48 hours after the change occurred within the legislative assemblies, which took place on May 1st, and without the population being aware of this, they decided to reform the El Salvador Constitution starting May 1st, where this agreement were ratified on any day. And this is where the central point is that this ratification, what it implied, if it were ratified at that moment or not, is that a legislation, just one assembly, could reform the Constitution without the need for two integrations, as I had explained previously. This represented enormous risk, which we will describe a bit about this. Thus, starting from that moment, from April 29th, the only thing they expected was the moment to be able to approve ratification. And with the ratification of the reform, what was changing was how the Constitution will be reformed. And this is an important element because it had been considered by the Constitutional Assembly as something that could not be reformed for any consideration, like the central nucleus of the Constitution, for example, the type of government, re-election, etc. That's the main change that was introduced from this constitutional reform, and the El Salvador Constitution goes from being a constitution that was very rigid because it had a process for it to be reformed, for us established and paused process. It goes on to be a flexible process, a highly flexible constitution, because in a matter of minutes it can be modified and reformed. In theory, all the constitutions has a formal superiority where the authorities when the authorities act, they have to be willing to do what the Constitution says. The same thing occurs with ordinary citizens. We have to be subject to this, and the judges as well. All of their rulings have to be subject to what the Constitution says. The Constitution is the apex of what their decisions are based on. But there's also material superiority. What it means that based on the material, the Constitution has a hierarchy. It's above everything. In El Salvador, based on what is happening, there is no formal superiority, no formal supremacy, because the authorities don't follow what the Constitution says. What the citizen protection mechanism says are not respected. And what it says is what occurs is not based on what the Constitution says. Proof of this is what the reform done in 2021 by allowing immediate re-election, which the Constitution forbids in more than 7 articles. So we can say that a conclusion of this first moment is that the Constitution and any country must function as protection for the rights. However, in El Salvador, this no longer occurs. It no longer works this way. And when you ask me what motivated the assembly to do this, what they said was that they had to reform it, that it was an old constitution, and they needed to modify it to protect it, the rights of the people in a better way. However, as we had said, the fact that a constitution has existed for 30 years, so to speak, that does not mean that it could not be reformed, as I already explained. However, they had certain protocols and processes that had to be followed in order for to consider a constitutional reform that had been established. So just to return to this, that the Constitution had been reformed 23 times prior to this process that took place last year. Thank you, Ruth. I believe that the audio quality has improved, so thank you for that adjustment. And there's a very important element with regards to the role of the Constitution, which is not a sheet of paper that exists just because it does exist. As you've mentioned, it's the limit and protection to the rights of the citizens as a central element for the role of this important document. And in this context, we've mentioned the political situation where this reform takes place. Can you please describe in general terms regarding how the assembly is made up and the very well-known popularity of the president? Are there other elements we should also take into consideration? First place, this reform was made possible from the moment that the legislative order, in our case, it means it's just one assembly, it's just one power. It's made up by a majority of the official power that was achieved from the government in power in 2021, and it was made reality in 2024 because of the electoral reforms that also took place. And we cannot forget that when in an electoral system, the components are changed, the ingredients are changed, well, the results will also be different. Now, my apologies, my phone is ringing. Within this context, it was possible by achieving this superior number of official party members. And these majorities are not new in the region. There are several moments where there has been a higher majority in several countries. I'm thinking, for example, in Venezuela. I'm also thinking of Nicaragua. And now Mexico also has a composition of its assembly, of its Congress, of a majority. We have to remember that in 2019, Bukele wins the elections with a great rejection towards the traditional political parties and also anti-partisan strategy. In 2020 for the 2021 elections, it was marked by the COVID pandemic and by the controls that the Legislative Assembly, that it still had a multi-partisan composition, and the Constitutional Assembly that was used as a control mechanism. They constantly, the Assembly as well as the Congress, were setting certain limits to the executive branch, which was used to try to remove legitimacy from the controls. Oh, I can't do it because they don't allow me to do it. I want to, but they don't let me do it. So the assembly was subject to reduction in 2024, to a reduction of the number of its members, of its how many members are in it. So we have to describe, for example, those general terms regarding how the Congress is made up, the popularity, etc. We also have to begin from that this composition where for 2024 there are the electoral reforms that change the way in which the citizens are going to elect and the results that will be produced from this election. For example, the argument at this moment to reduce the number of congressmen, that before it was 84, now it's 60, is that there was too much expense for the assembly. We had to reduce it and eliminate those things. That was the main argument, too much expense. However, this is not entirely true because when somebody changes the number of people that will be inside an entity and you reduce it, the possibilities also reduce for a multi-representative composition. This is math thing. If we're going to see budget issues, which was the justification used at that moment, we can see how in 2024 the budget for the Legislative Assembly was $54.2 million. However, and at that moment it was 84 congressmen. So 54.2 in 2000, it was also 84 congressmen, and the budget was 15.5 million. In 2002, $17.7 million, and it was still with 84 congressmen. So the budget issue has nothing to do with the number of congressmen because it has to do with the amount of expenses that we approve for them. Now, with 60 congressmen for this year, $46.4 million were approved for budget. What am I saying with this? That the number of congressmen present corresponds to the type of budget that will be approved, which obviously was reduced. As I mentioned, in year 2000, it was 84 congressmen and was $15 million. So besides this, we have to take into consideration that the Legislative Assembly has three main roles. One has to create laws, as the Congress in any country to create laws. On the other hand, they also have to has a role of name the officials that will make up the control organisms or the accountability institutions. The assembly has this responsibility of naming these people, but beyond this, it has a role of controlling the executive branch through several mechanisms. They can interrogate the officials, they can convene them to Congress and present reports where they're held accountable. They could also have create special organisms to investigate anything like special cases, like for example, a very case of a huge fraud that took place where the government has had responsibility where certain verification processes were not followed. So I use this example to relate it regarding what is the power that the Legislative Assembly has to be able to convene officials from the executive branch. However, when we analyze these three roles of the Legislative Assembly, and we have to take into consideration, because of the context in El Salvador, to understand how a constitutional reform is approved overnight. If we analyze these three things, we see that the assembly has no longer fulfills its roles. And I'll begin with the first one. In the case of legislative branch, the majority of the decrees right now from 2021 on do not begin the assembly. They are approved from initiatives from the executive branch. In other words, the executive branch takes to the legislative branch, this is what I want to be approved. And there is no debate. Almost more than 40%, according to a study done by Observa El Salvador, more than 40% of what is sent to the Legislative Assembly by the executive branch is gone, is just approved right away. This does not mean that it's approved. It's possible in emergency situations. I want to be very clear that in an emergency situation, you're not going to follow the entire process for an ordinary law because you have to resolve an issue right away. But it would seem that we're living in a permanent emergency because we've seen that over 40% are approved in this way. Even the constitutional reform was approved by exemption of our procedures. For example, it's approved in two moments. Before it was two assemblies, now you just need one. With this constitutional reform of Article 248, the first part or the first stage is approving the agreement of the constitutional reform. This took place on April 29th in less than 2 hours. In less than 120 minutes, it was approved. The reform agreement was between the moment it was presented in front of every congressperson there and the moment where everybody raised their hand and they say it's approved. We have to take it into consideration because it shows how even if it was done in an erroneous way, because it wasn't done prior to the election, instead it was done after the election, it was still done in a hurriedly. So, and the second stage that we just saw right now is the ratification of this agreement that was done very, very quickly without consultation or debates. It was done in 27 minutes. That's how long it took between presenting the document and the moment that it was approved. That's when it comes to the legislative function. When it comes to electing people or choosing people for the accountability, for the comptrollers, the electoral organism, etc., none of the public institutions in El Salvador that are part of this accountability system fulfill a control function. In El Salvador, we can ensure that there is no institution for accountability that acts in defense of El Salvador people. And I could mention to increase, there's a Cristosal webpage where we have a presentation of all the institutions that we evaluate the comptroller systems in El Salvador, and we're going to update it every year because we did this in 2024 with regard to 2023, and this year we will update it. Regarding the third one, controlling the executive branch, the assembly should do it in an independent fashion. And I say this very firmly, the assembly renounced its role to denounce the executive branch to just be a branch that approves everything, because legislative role implies debate, implies participation, other elements within the El Salvador context, and it became the branch that approves all laws sent by the executive branch. So to finalize and sum up this question, we can say four things. Ever since Bukele came into power, they've disarticulated several of these branches, and they've stopped using the controlling tools that they have. And for example, May 6, 2024, we presented 10 things, a demand against the constitutional reform that have been approved on April 29th. Up to now, the Constitutional Assembly has not said anything. And of course, they can't say anything because it's an institution that has been taken over by the executive branch, and it's now made up of people that don't fulfill that role. The second element is there no respect for the defense of human rights or respecting human rights. Because by constantly approving the state of exception, sometimes the state of exception is only focused on an issue of security, and here we're talking of suspending constitutional rights, and besides modifying the legislation regarding, for example, public expense, thinking of everything public purchases system. This means that we can see that the power is concentrated in just one person in El Salvador. By eliminating the balance system, this is very important. When we lose, the judges stop acting. When the judges start responding only in favor of another power, in this case, the executive branch, and the citizens are afraid because losing the guarantee of having a fair trial, fair process, or simply if there is justice exists in cases certain trials are taken to the courtroom. And decisions are based for the countries are based on the interest of few. For example, how the public money is used, how 80% of the public pensions fund is used by the government, how the Bitcoin law was approved without any type of discussion. This didn't bring any benefit for the population, and also the mining activities I could mention. There was also approved in less than 72 hours a law that will definitely affect the population. These are the costs that we're seeing or the consequences of not having institutionality that responds to the interest of the population. And these are elements you have to take into consideration because, in light of this high popularity for Bukele, that in theory justifies any type of abuse committed by him.
Gracias, Ruth. Creo que
Thank
estos elementos es una
you,
señal que han
Ruth.
sido
Among
varias y
the
todos muy
elements that you've
importantes.
mentioned, and all
Sin
of them are
duda,
very
el tema
important,
del rol de la
without a
Asamblea en
doubt, the
estas
role of
tres
the Assembly in these
segmentos,
three
¿no? De hacer las
segments,
leyes, nombrar
creating
funcionarios
laws,
y controlar
controlling
el Ejecutivo,
officials,
sobre
and
todo, que en
placing
este
limits on the
momento
executive
hemos
branch.
visto que es
Right now, we've
más que
seen
todo una
that
herramienta
it's more
del
of a
Ejecutivo,
it's a
el control
tool
que
used
tiene
by the
para
executive
aprobar
branch,
leyes
a
como las que
control
tiene
that
el
it has to
constitucional,
approve laws that,
la
as you
prohibición de la
mentioned,
minería
for
se
example,
levantó,
removing the
la
ban
ley de
on mining
bienes no se aprobó sin
activities.
ningún
They approved the
precedente
Bitcoin
y
law
así
without a
tenemos
prior
algunos
study,
ejemplos
and we could
de
give
cómo el
further
Ejecutivo
examples of how the executive
manda
branch
al
it
legislativo.
controls
Y
the
otro elemento
was
que creo que hace eco
of the of the
para los casos
legislative
de las
branch.
organizaciones que
And
están
something
en
else that I
Estados
could
Unidos
mention in the
es
case
esto de
for
la eficiencia,
organizations
¿no?
here in the
Es
President of the United States,
recortar
the
personal,
quote unquote
recortar
efficiency,
instituciones por
cutbacks to
una cuestión de
personnel, to
eficiencia. Y ya
institutions
ustedes
for
saben que
a
en el
quote unquote
caso de la
efficiency
Asamblea de
issue.
El
And as you
Salvador, que
mentioned,
pasó a
in the
60
case of
diputados,
the El
tienen
Salvador
van un
Assembly,
presupuesto
which
muy alto,
moved from 84 to
mucho
60
más alto que
congressmen,
otros
it
años
still
donde
has a
tenían
very high
menos.
budget,
Entonces,
much
creo
higher
que
budget than compared
estas
to other
cosas nos
years with
llaman la
a greater
atención
number
porque
of
se está hablando
congressmen. This
mucho
is
de
something
la
that's
eficiencia,
noteworthy
¿no? Del
because we
departamento de
keep hearing
eficiencia
about
gubernamental.
efficiency, for
Y
example, in
aquí
Doge in the
vamos
United
a entrar a
States.
otra pregunta
Here, we're going
y
to
es
enter
cuáles
another
serían
question,
esos
and is
verdaderos objetivos.
which would be those true objectives?
Sobre el tema, sí, sobre el tema de la eficiencia, voy a
Regarding
pasar
efficiency, I'm going to something
detrás
I
del
want to
discurso
mention.
de la
Behind
eficiencia
this
hay una
discourse of
concentración de poder
efficiency,
y la
what we're doing
desmoralización
is
de instituciones
concentrating
esenciales
powers that
como
all the
poder de control
institutions that are
sobre
function as
los
control
servicios.
points
Entonces,
regarding public administration.
digamos, la eficiencia
The
no es sinónimo de
efficiency,
recorte
it's not
presupuestario, la
synonymous with
eficiencia
budget cuts.
estamos hablando
Efficiency,
aquí,
we're
por
not
ejemplo,
talking
la
about
participación
here.
que se elimina
The efficiency,
sistema de transparencia para
eliminate
la
the
compra pública,
transparency
por ejemplo,
system
se
for
lo mandó,
public
¿verdad?
purchases because we have to do it
Pero
quicker.
eso lo que lleva
But
es a más
what this
posibilidades también de
leads to
corrupción
is
y
greater possibilities of corruption. And as we all know, all
ahora,
corruption
uno
vulnerates
de los
human
verdaderos
rights.
objetivos de
When
todas
it
las
comes to the
acciones
true objectives
constitucionales,
behind these
bueno,
constitutional
si
changes,
yo tuviera que
well,
enumerarlos,
if I had to name them
empezaría por
or
la
number them,
concentración de
I would
poder,
begin with
por desarticular
concentrating
las
the
funciones
power or
exteriores, es decir, eliminar la
by
posibilidad de
eliminating the
transparencia,
possibility
tanto
for
la
people
generación de
to have any type of
oportunidades que se
any
vio con el
control or
cambio de la ley de
accountability.
transparencia que hizo
For
el
example,
Supremo
when they
Constitucional
change
y que
the
fue
re-election
decisivo
clause
para,
in order
para, esta,
to
para
for
permitir la
this
reelección
to
inmediata,
which made
así
re-election
como la
in an immediate
reforma
fashion, as
constitucional
well as the
aprobada por la
constitutional
Asamblea
reform that was
Legislativa
approved recently by the
de
Legislative
Legislativa,
Assembly
no son
for the
dirigidas
mining
a favorecer
initiative.
al pueblo
It's
salvadoreño.
they don't want to favor. It's
Ese es
not
un
in the
punto que
interest
en
of the
favor del pueblo,
Salvador
del gusto del
people. That
pueblo, esa
discourse of
retórica permanente
for the people's
en nombre del
interest,
pueblo,
in name of
realmente
the people,
lo que
it's
termina es en, y eso
at the
dice
end of
la
the day,
Constitución
we've
salvadoreña
seen it
que
in other
menciona
countries in Latin America,
esta
is
ansia, en esta
this
disputa también
this
entre
dispute,
otras
this
instituciones, cuando
fight
todavía hay instituciones independientes,
when
por mantenerse
when
en
there
el
was still an
poder.
independent
Y al
system in order
final,
to
por
stay in power.
asegurarse
And at the end
de
of the day,
que
in order to
quien llegue
ensure that
a tomar
that
el poder no vaya a
whoever
cometer nunca
comes next will never face a trial or
Así
never face any
que
criminal
yo creo que los
consequences.
verdaderos
So
objetivos
I
son
think that the true
claros,
objectives
no
are
son
very
nuevos en la
clear. They
historia,
aren't new in our
no,
history,
no solo en la salvadoreña, sino del
and not
mundo,
only in El Salvador history, but
¿verdad?
throughout the world, but
Donde
in
estos
particular
cambios
Latin America,
constitucionales lo
where
único
these
que han
constitutional
permitido es
changes, all
apelar.
their true intention is to just stay in power.
Gracias, Ruth. Y
Thank
desde
you, Ruth.
Cristosal
And
sabemos que hacen
in,
un
from
muy buen
Cristosal,
trabajo
we know
en
that you
informar a la
do very
población,
good work in
en
informing the
explicar lo
population, in
complejo que estos cambios
explaining
implican
how
y
these complex
el verdadero
changes, what
impacto,
they
¿no?
imply, and
La
the true
población.
impact in the
Y ante eso,
population.
¿cuáles son los
And
puntos que
in
más
light of
preocupan a la
this, what are the
organización en
elements that
esta
most
reforma?
concern the population
Yo
with these
creería que
reforms?
más que
I would
Cristosal,
say
toda la
that
población con
beyond
pensamiento
Cristosal,
crítico.
the entire
Muchas
population that has
veces
critical
los
thinking,
abusos
I
de
think
poder. Es
that
decir, cuando
abuse of
las
power,
instituciones dejan de
when the
funcionar como
Constitution
límites del
stopped
poder y como
working as
garantías de
limits
los
to the
derechos
power and
de los
as a
seres humanos,
guarantee for the rights of the
entonces está
population,
el abuso
well,
permanente
there's
del
a
poder.
permanent
Aquí
abuse for the
podemos
people in
hablar, por
power.
ejemplo, de
Here we can speak about the constitutional reform that could go from the death penalty to approving the death penalty, which in El Salvador it's not allowed, or eliminating the how many limits people can, how much land a person can own. The Constitution it limits this, but they might eliminate this for the public officials. Also add other elements, for example, property seizures, that as a matter of fact, it's already happening because even though we have to give economic compensation to the people when there's a public interest over an asset, they're not paying them, nor they're paying a fair price. And at the same time, there's a mechanism that for the to take away these properties. But also there are guarantees established by the Constitution with regards to the limits to the phone interventions, that there are certain constitutional locks that we have seen through laws, not necessarily constitutional reforms. I'm thinking of the reform, the undercover digital undercover agents or the Pegasus software. By eliminating these constitutional guarantees, the possibilities of obtaining these information, it's a greater risk. But we could also continue and think of another element, another reform that would be harmful for the population. And this happening is eliminating the right for your home to not be invaded. Like in theory, like for example, security officer or police officer could enter your home, and if there's a crime that's occurring, if something bad is taking place, on the contrary, if not, they have to show a warrant. So in practical terms, this is not happening, but there is a constitutional guarantee that restricts the possibility of people entering your home illegally. And besides this, I'll go beyond, I'll go even further. I'm thinking about the elimination of the autonomy of the El Salvador University. In El Salvador, the government, the executive branch, owes millions to the El Salvador University, and lately they've shown a very strong stance regarding the mining activities, and it can be used perfectly well as under that discourse. Oh, we have to improve the higher education, we have to have a reform because that discourse is used of improving, that things will be better, in order to dismantle this type of institution, like for example such an important institution such as the El Salvador University, and which violates the and also the municipal autonomy. Now before it used to be over 200 municipalities, now it's much less than them. It's already established and this already disappeared, and this affects the municipal autonomy because it implies that municipalities don't have the capability to invest based on what they consider are government structures, in this case the local governments. Instead, they depend on the willingness of the central government. This can all be modified with this constitutional reform, things that can be done. And I would add to this, I believe her connection paused. My apologies. And supposedly, according to what they've said right now, this could change at any moment for 2 periods. As a matter of fact, it could also be for undefined terms. So for this, I recommend the recent ruling issued by Inter-American Just Court for in the case of Nicaragua. It's worth reading on it. I could mention other issues that could be modified. For example, securing labor rights, so eliminating certain guaranteed rights, but also in the terms of what the state of El Salvador could turn into Cali. But right now, none of this could surprise us. Everything, many people that have mentioned this, they've given their opinion. This will not happen. This is impossible. It might happen. It's happened in El Salvador. It's happened in the United States. So the limits to how many periods they can be in power, if there are institutions that exercise a controlling function, they don't exist. So we have to take that into consideration. What is true is that when they want to satisfy the needs of the population, they don't need constitutional reforms of this type. They would need, first of all, to fulfill the legal framework. So that I would say that to respond to that question. Thank you, Ruth. And in that sense, to make the most of this time, I'm going to move on to the next question. And it's that within this regional context, we've seen similar tendencies in other countries in Latin America. How is the El Salvador case compared to other recent constitutional reforms in the region? It's very, very similar. We can also mention a pattern in some countries, for example, capturing the judicial system, in particular the constitutional systems. The constitutional system, they are permissive and they allow constitutional reforms that make it possible to somebody to stay in power forever. For example, in the case of Peru, in the case of Honduras, Nicaragua, in the case of El Salvador, we saw how in other countries like Colombia, they established a limit, they put the brakes to it. This has many similarities. There is a pattern regarding how long a person stays in power. But at executive level, we see some similar tendencies when it comes to efficiency, reducing public expenses. It doesn't mean that the institutions and that the governments don't have to use resources in the best way past the resources that are provided by every one of us. I think that's not the point of that's being discussed. What's being discussed in how this discourse of restricting, of reducing the public expenses, of improving that quote unquote efficiency, of showing muscle and security aspects, which is another common point when it comes to the iron fist and also these aspects where they violate human rights. It's used as a contradiction between protecting the rights and security. They are not contradictory. It's possible to build a security model by respecting rights. So I think that the issue of this similar tendencies is very clear in Latin America in light of what's happening in El Salvador, and also how this becomes a reference to violating human rights. Anything can be allowed in order to obtain a greater goal. For example, they could use security as an excuse, etc. Thank you, Ruth. Due to time constraints, I want to skip over some questions in the chat and also see a person's hand raised. I'm going to read the questions in the chat, and then I will allow Carmen to. So in case anybody else wants to participate, raise your hand or you can write your question in the chat. The first question is, what is your opinion? What is the public opinion regarding the Legislative Assembly in general terms and its congressmen? Are they acknowledged in the street? Do the people make petitions or requests, or do they denounce them? How have the local political leaders reacted in light of the loss of public participation space because of the reduction of municipalities? And go ahead, Carmen, who has raised your hand.
Sí, gracias. Buenas tardes
Yes,
con todos.
thank
Mi
you. Good
pregunta en
afternoon
sí
to
es,
everybody. My
¿qué
question
ahora el
is,
gobierno de El Salvador
why is the
está
El
haciendo
Salvador
tanto por gobiernar a
government
Estados Unidos para
creating
llevar
pacts or
inmigrantes a
agreements
la
with the
cárcel?
United
Grande
States
ese que
government
tiene,
to
famosísimo.
welcome their
No comprendo por qué
immigrants? I don't understand the purpose of
se
this
supone que
because
Nayib
Bukele
supuestamente va a
supposedly
cobrar
will charge
una
a
X
fee,
cantidad por
the
esa
undetermined
persona, ¿verdad?
amount
Pero
for every prisoner that they
en
welcome.
sí,
But in
¿qué es el
general
pacto ahora?
terms,
¿Qué es lo
why
que el
what's
gobierno
the reason
salvadoreño
behind the
quiere sacar
agreement
de
right
eso? Si es
now?
que
Why does El
quiere
Salvador
tomar
what does El
ventaja
Salvador want
o
to
es
obtain
solamente
from
por parte
this?
de dinero,
Just
no sé,
to gain
pero pienso de que
popularity,
antes de que las
or
personas las manden allá,
before the people are
todos
sent
tienen los
there,
derechos para
everybody has the right to
los derechos, ¿verdad?
the
Los
rights
derechos que todo ser humano tiene,
that
porque no
every
es
human being has,
de que si te
because
van a deportar, que te
if you're
deporten,
going to
pues
be
no,
deported,
deportarte a
well,
un
be
país encima es
deported, but to
morir
send you
cárcel.
to a country to spend
Entonces, mi
time
pregunta
to be sent
es,
directly
no sé
to
si usted
another
me tiene
jail,
alguna
I don't
respuesta.
know if you have a
Tengo
response to this.
preocupación. Gracias.
I am concerned about
Gracias,
this. Thank
Carmen.
you.
Ruth,
Thank
adelante.
you, Carmen. Go ahead, Ruth. Well,
Empiezo con la opinión sobre la Asamblea Legislativa.
regarding the
La
public opinion on the Legislative Assembly, the opinion has gone down. The Legislative Assembly, many of the congressmen are not known by the population. Many of them vote for the flag by the party logo or symbol. But many of them, they're not known in the street because nobody knows who they are. Some of them have a, because they've been in power so many years, people do know them. Many of them aren't even allowed to participate in Congress. They don't even recognize their right for representation and participation, which they supposedly have because through the vote of the people. Instead, many of them arrive from because of the flag or the number of the congressmen that the political party obtains from the electoral process. So many of them are unknown, but I insist in the last measurements, you can see the latest survey, which was published less than a month ago, where there's a tendency going down regarding the image of the Legislative Assembly because at the end, they only produce what the executive branch sends them, but they don't have activity beyond this. With regards to how the local political leaders reacted to this reduction in municipalities and reduction in the spaces for participation, I heard you mention that in the case of El Salvador, as it occurs in other places, the in the case of the political parties was they were a pillar to it was how Nayib Bukele came into power, first of all, because of his role as a mayor. And he maintained it because of his discourse, as mentioned, that by going railing against the Arena political party. So there has been a lot of silence. The political powers, the political leaders are not saying anything, and it's not as if they have this great base of population that accompanies them. And in this discourse that it was they had their turn, so now it's our turn, so they are relegated. There hasn't been any organized expression or structured expression because of the from the narrative of they simply because of what has happened is well this is what the people wanted. And with regards to this agreement between the El Salvador government and United States government, there's many things to say about this, but I do believe that what Bukele wants is unconditional support or to be in good standing with the United States government. I think that one of the most active presidents in showing their support to a determined political party was Bukele, with the support given to Donald Trump. And this continues happening. And this happened in the prior government as well, because we cannot forget that United States, they are criminal gang leaders are being facing trial in the United States. So it's also known in El Salvador that this relationship that existed between the gang leaders and the current government leaders right now. So I think that what he's seeking the support to this offering of using this transactional policy that the United States government, which I'll give you, but what do you give me back? So also finding a political ally in El Salvador, which is very important, but it's no longer that important because we are looking for new friends where it's playing a little in this geopolitical scenario and to have a more favorable image for the United States, where the population also acknowledges that the relationship is very much more important than the relationship with China. But up to what point can this relationship with the United States will continue being good? They all think that it depends on how much the president offers to the U.S. Where I think that there are other factors, for example, this link between the El Salvador government with the gang leaders that are jailed in the US.
Gracias, Ruth.
Thank you,
Invitamos a
Ruth.
quien
We
quiera alzar la
ask
mano y
that
pedir
anybody who
palabra,
wants to raise their hand
realizar
to
su pregunta.
participate.
Mientras
Or
tanto,
in the
tengo
meantime,
una pregunta
I have a question
relacionada a la construcción
related
de una
to
narrativa
the
de nueva
building
democracia en El
a
Salvador,
narrative of
que
a
también
new
había mencionado
democracy in El
anteriormente.
Salvador, which
Y
had been
es
mentioned
si
previously.
podría
If the
explicarnos a
question
qué
is,
se
if
refiere esta
can you
nueva
explain what
democracia
this
y
new
de qué
democracy
manera esta
means
reforma en la
and how
Constitución
this constitutional
contribuye al proyecto
reform
político del
will
presidente
contribute
Bukele
to
y qué
Bukele's
significa, ¿no?, para
political
el país.
project and what it
Bueno,
means for the
quiero
country?
partir de este
Well,
concepto
I
de
want to
democracia
begin with this
con estos
concept
tres
of
elementos que
democracy
debe
with these
cumplir
three
mínimo
elements that he
según
must
la
comply
Convención
with
de
at the
Elecciones
very
Libres,
minimum.
Democráticas y
The first one
Competitivas
are
en
free
El Salvador.
and
Si hay una
frequent
elección libre,
elections
yo creo
in
que
El
ya eso queda
Salvador. I think
solucionado,
that
de que no hay
whether or not it's
posibilidad
free in
que
El
haya una
Salvador, that's something we
repetición
could
de
debate
sufragio,
on.
no hay sanciones
There
a favor de la
are
ley electoral
no
y el
sanctions
ejercicio
for
político del
who
gobierno, y
violates
no se
any
fiscaliza
electoral laws. The
el financiamiento de
the
partidos
financing of political parties is not audited.
no se le
It's
obliga al partido
they're
de
not
gobierno a
the
entregar
political party is not forced to present the documents. A lot of public financing is used unduly, and in the case of the party in power right now, so that restricts the free and open elections, which will be that could give opportunity for another discussion. Another thing is to guarantee the rights in El Salvador. In El Salvador, we have a very good constitution, a beautiful constitution. The way it's built, however, there aren't any guarantees that these rights will be respected within the country. There's nothing that guarantees respecting these rights. And a third element are the controlling systems for the institutions that effectively audit the, the government. And this is just so this building this new democracy where there aren't the rights aren't guaranteed, there aren't controlling institutions. Well, anything there's anything but a democracy. It's an authoritarian regime. And in the international perspective, the most favorable to acknowledge is if we live in an authoritarian regime or not. But we all there aren't people that I know that could identify what's happening in El Salvador. I can say that we are
Gracias,
living
Ruth.
in a
Nos
democracy.
preguntan
Thank you,
qué
Ruth.
similitudes tiene la
What
situación actual de El Salvador
similarities
con las
are
recientes
there with the
reformas de
current
México
situation in El
sobre la
Salvador with
eliminación
the
del
recent
principio de
reforms
transparencia
in
y el cambio del
Mexico
sistema
by
judicial?
eliminating the transparency and changing the judicial system? There are many concerns with what's happening in Mexico. We already saw because the first institute that was dismantled during Bukele's first period was the Institute of Access for Information. They limited the access to information for the population. The format one thing is the formality, and the other thing is that this change implies that there no longer is an independence for institutions that will guarantee the rights to the population. Like, for example, access to information. In El Salvador, we have a law that was acknowledged, recognized as one of the best ones, and now happens to be a law that's no longer applied because everything that you're asked, it's declared as confidential. In Cristosal, we filed over thousands of requests and only 20% of them were delivered. That's for you to get an idea of the deterioration of the right. It also implies that you cannot have complete citizen participation because I can't battle corruption if I don't have access to information I need to do this. That's on the one hand. And on the other hand, in the case of the judicial branch, El Salvador already lived through this. We saw reform in 2021 where not only they don't only remove the constitutional assembly, they changed the judges from this constitutional assembly, but there's a massive firing of judges that were over 70 years old. As a matter of fact, both cases are in the International Rights Court, and we hope it's a process that we hope That's something that we follow up on Cristosal. Beyond this, they also created new entities, new courtroom. There's a, there's a function you can move a judge from one place to another one immediately. We can go see the case of Bolivia, where they're also they also have a similar model where we have to question how the electoral campaigns will be financed for these people when it comes to the candidates, how the candidates are going to be made up. I think that there's a lot of, we have to follow up a lot. And as a matter of fact, many civil society organizations, we're asking to create a follow-up plan, an action plan to see how these things take place and to have an observation process for these elections, because definitely other things might happen. Oh, they're going to remember when such and such thing happened. That would be, we will no longer have to do a preventive analysis as it should be right now. And I am very, very concerned in the case of Mexico. Thank you, Ruth. Is there any other question, whether it be a chat or would you like to raise your hand? While we wait, I'm going to read another question. What can civil society do and the El Salvador population abroad and the international community in light of these changes, these alarm and warning signs of this deterioration that we've registered? What actions do you consider are urgent for right now? Well, in first place, we have to stop normalizing abuses. In other words, popularity, just the fact that you're popular doesn't mean you can do anything you want. Being popular does not mean you have to guarantee the rights of the population. In the same way that there's no good corrupt person, there's no good authoritarian person. Regardless of this, we have to denounce these things. For those of us who stay in the country, we have to continue calling out these human rights violations. That's an issue that I address permanently, but also the violations that take place in, it's normalized. We live in a state violence situation that's very noteworthy, and it's caused a reflection point, because before they used to be afraid of gangs, but now they're afraid of many other things because they're afraid of what the state will do. The possibility of being to express themselves freely, because that might cause any type of consequences, because a large segment of the population has claimed that they are afraid of expressing themselves freely. And we have to do a little more, not only being informed and verifying the sources, because sometimes we don't take into consideration all sources, but we have to multiply these claims at an international level. We also have to have reflection regarding how permissive the other branches are, and to denounce all abuse that is committed in the country. It's an enormous responsibility for those that are outside. And I say this clearly. In many cases, they've told me, I'm afraid because my family is still in El Salvador. So that barrier of fear, I mean, if they feel that outside the country, imagine how it feels inside the country. But the role of filing these complaints, of denouncing, going to the human rights defenders and activists and any other person that could have a critical influence in this, I think they have a mission of denouncing all these things. Thank you, Ruth. There are many people that give you thanks to your response and your contribution, and you've left them thinking. There's one final question, and we might finalize with this one. What is the greater challenge to raise awareness in the population that is far away from the discussions regarding the state structure and how democracy functions? That's the eternal question in El Salvador. I think that is for the daily problems, we sometimes from the academy or the organizations, we have a language that's very structured, but at the same time, I think that one of the greater challenges is to take all these problems. How does this affect me for this reform? How does the reform affect me or my neighbor, the community? Why should I care about this? I think that this is where this question regarding government structure, when people know that because in case somebody is fired from a public institution and they don't have anywhere to turn to have their rights recognized, that's where we reach people most. It's a big challenge. There's multiple examples. We have the case of the farmers. The number of people that have been fired and displaced because of the cases of people have simply disappeared. So many things that are happening. So in many cases, until the people don't feel it affects them directly because of the lack of structure, because of the lack of not having an institution that responds to their interests, they don't they don't have that awareness regarding what's happening. But I think that the solution you can be
Muchas
found there.
gracias, Ruth. Realmente
Thank you
es
very
un
much,
desafío que tenemos que seguir
Ruth. That's a challenge that we have
abordando
to
en
continue
general.
addressing
Creo
in
que
general
esta
terms. I think
conversación, con todos
that
los desafíos
this
técnicos que
conversation,
tenemos,
with
ha
all the
sido
technical
muy,
challenges
muy
that we
buena
had,
y
was very,
esperamos
very good,
siempre
and we
contar
hope
con su valiosa
to
información y
always
análisis
rely
en
on
estos
your
espacios.
contribution and analysis
Agradecemos
for this
también a todas las
space.
personas que
We
nos
also give
acompañaron
thanks
hoy.
to everybody who
Les
accompanied
invitamos
us
a seguir el
today.
trabajo de
We're going to
Cristosal
invite you
y de Alianza
to follow
Américas para
Cristosal's
mantenerse
work and Alianza
informados
America's work
sobre la situación
to
en El
stay
Salvador y en
informed
la
regarding the
región.
situation
Y
in
si
El
desean
Salvador
más
and the
información o
region.
participar en
If
algún
you
foro,
wish to have more
pueden seguirnos
information
en nuestras
or
redes
participate in
sociales.
future
Y
events, you
pues
can
muchas
follow us on
gracias
social media.
nuevamente, Ruth,
And thank
por
you
tu
once again.
análisis,
Thank
por
you,
tu
Ruth, for
presencia, por tu
your
trabajo
analysis, for your
y a
presence
todas
and
las
your
personas que
work.
están acá.
And
Así
to
que
everybody that was here, thank you very much.
invitación.
Thank you for the invitation. And of course, thank you
gracias
to those
y
who were
seguimos en
present today.
contacto. Que pasen
And
buen
thank
día.
you. We will keep in touch. Have a great day.